Be inspired, supported, and empowered. This is the Global Healthy Living Foundation podcast network.
Welcome to From Hair to There, a podcast about alopecia, where we bridge the gap between patients, healthcare professionals, and you, our listeners. We bring you diverse alopecia areata stories from around the world, highlighting the challenges and successes of living with alopecia areata and reminding you that you are never alone in this journey. Hair loss isn't just physical, it's emotional, mental, and even spiritual, and we're here to discuss it all. I'm Adam Kegley, Manager of Global Partnerships at Global Healthy Living Foundation, and your co-host for this episode. Today, I'm excited to introduce my fellow co-host, Supriya Surrender. She is someone who doesn't just speak about alopecia areata, she lives it and is a fierce patient advocate.
Thank you, Adam. It's been quite the journey for me as an alopecia areata patient advocate, and I'm here to share it all. I believe that every alopecia areata patient has a unique story, and by sharing ours, we can inspire, motivate, and uplift each other. Whether you're an alopecia areata patient, a caregiver, a medical professional, or someone just wanting to learn, this podcast is for you.
So tune in and let's embark on this journey from hair to there. We have a full house today with 4 wonderful guests joining us to talk about the many aspects of alopecia areata that make it more than lost hair, including 3 wonderful ladies living with alopecia working with the Canadian Alopecia Areata Foundation, or CANAF, who are also patient advocates. That would be Sara Christal Malcolm, and Lauryn Harrison, as well as Dr. Laurie Ferguson, clinical psychologist.
We have a lot of ground to cover and an incredible crew to cover it with. So let's dig in and kick things off. Why don't we start by each of you telling us who you are, name, location, and how long ago you were diagnosed, and giving us one line about why you're excited to talk about why alopecia areata is more than just lost hair. Let's start with Sara. Welcome.
Thanks, Supriya. Thanks, Adam. It's wonderful to be here. So I was diagnosed with alopecia areata when I was 6 years old, and I'm 27 now, and I grew up in a small town just north of Toronto. And just like most places, alopecia wasn't well known. And I'm really excited to be here and having this conversation with you all today, because when someone sees alopecia, they may think a lot of things, but they may not think about what that person is going through inside. So thank you so much for bringing out this topic so that we can have an open discussion about it. It's really important for people to be aware of the toll alopecia can take on someone's mental health.
Thank you. And now, Christal.
Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here. So I was diagnosed with a form of scarring alopecia approximately about 20 years ago. It's been quite a roller coaster. I'm born and raised in Scarborough, Ontario all my life. And I'm really excited to have this conversation because I feel like there's so many assumptions surrounding hair loss. And I think this conversation is an excellent way to debunk the myths versus facts. And I hope that this conversation also inspires people and motivates people that, that they're not alone in any of this. And I know that alopecia can be very isolating, but I'm hoping through this conversation with all of you that your listeners will find some hope beyond the strands.
Thank you. I'm certain they will find some hope with this incredible crew of alopecia areata warriors here. And how about you, Lauryn?
Well, it's amazing to be here tonight, and I'm tuning in from Burlington, Ontario, which is where I was born and raised, a small town just outside of Toronto. And I was diagnosed with alopecia areata when I was 3 years old. It waxed and waned and then progressed to alopecia universalis when I was 13. And 10 years later, I'm still rocking the bald. What really excites me about tonight is that it contributes to perspective, conversations like this. And I'm a big believer that when you change the way you look at things, the things that you look at change. So having a conversation that sort of challenges the preconceptions around alopecia, I think that contributes to this idea. And hopefully people leave the conversation feeling empowered and engaged and motivated.
Thank you all so much. And how about you, Dr. Ferguson?
I don't have alopecia, and I'm eager to learn more about how these warriors, who are indeed rocking the bald, all of them, deal with all of the challenges, and particularly the mental health challenges that come along with it. I think that may be one of the most under thought about or least thought about issues that comes along. And yet I think as I've experienced this talking to patients, it's a front and center problem all the time.
Before we fully jump into the topic, I wanted to set the stage a bit and talk about the societal views of hair loss. I know in the US, it doesn't matter what show you're watching or movie or book, bald always ends up being portrayed as either an illness, a villain, a monster, and that can really impact people's perception of hair loss when they see it in person, either on themselves or on others. I'm curious for you in Canada or even local to your province, what are the societal views like, and have those had a positive or negative impact on your hair loss journeys? Lauren, I'll start with you this time.
I would say that representation is a really tricky subject with alopecia because we know that broadly, as you say, on the screen, a bald villain might be really popular, or even in terms of health, sometimes hairlessness is associated with cancer or other disease. So I do find that where we are, Canadian-wide, I guess, there is sort of a negative connotation around hair loss or baldness specifically, and I think it's something that we continue to try to raise awareness in order to counteract.
Thank you. And Sara, how about you?
Yes, I don't think these kind of perspectives about alopecia end at the US border. Alopecia is uncommon everywhere in the world, and because it's so uncommon, there's not enough education around what it actually is and how it affects someone. Alopecia isn't well represented in media, and when it is, it's often in a negative or a very manufactured way, like you've described. Like, if someone who's bald playing the villain, right? And in everyday life, common things we hear are people assuming that we're sick or contagious because we have no hair. Even employers refusing to hire someone because they believe it will in some way impact their quality of work or the overall workplace environment. For alopecia areata specifically, which is an autoimmune disease, some of the inaccurate or even insensitive perspectives about it come from it being seen as a cosmetic concern and not a medical one. Because it's seen as a cosmetic concern, not a lot of funding goes into developing treatments, so options for regrowth are limited. Insurance companies only partially cover the cost of a single wig for a lifetime, which is not enough. And I'm sure the three of us can all say that we've had someone, whether a family member, a friend, or a stranger, tell us, it's just hair, not understanding what's going on beneath all of that. So what really is overlooked are the psychological and psychosocial impacts of alopecia. So, the effects of hair loss on someone's mental and social health. And the impacts of alopecia can be severe, causing someone to miss school or work or avoid social activities, which are essential to caring for your mental health. And so while someone else may think it's no big deal, to us, it's much different. So yes, the way society views hair loss is very surface level. They don't see beneath the skin, no pun intended.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think I get a twitch anytime somebody says, it's just hair. It's so much more than that.
Yes, absolutely.
And Christal, how about you?
Well, I think Lauryn and Sara just basically summed up everything that I was going to say. Fantastic job. I just feel like society just doesn't understand. I feel like looks are so important in today's world, and it seems to be the focal point for a lot of things. Like people make assumptions, like Sara said, based on if they're going to hire you or not, based on your appearance, not based on your ability or what's on your resume. So there's that part. And the comment about it's just hair, I think people just assume that we're being dramatic. Even friends and family were like, oh, you're still beautiful. You're still a great person. It's almost like they're overlooking what's happening to us emotionally, physically, psychologically. Like there's so many layers to it. And I feel like as much as we may have our cheerleaders around us, it's not enough because they're talking to somebody who's losing their hair, but they have a full head of hair. Do you know what I mean? So unless you walk in our shoes, you will have absolutely no idea. So like Sara was saying, it's not a US thing, it's a worldwide thing. And I feel like everyone within the alopecia community can attest that they experience the same sort of things and assumptions from people.
I couldn't agree with you more. I'm sure all of you have heard the comment, oh, well, at least you have the perfect shaped head for a bald head, you know?
I just got that comment on Tuesday.
Same. I got that last week.
What are you supposed to say back to that?
These are all such good points, and it really makes me think of kind of a similar question to Dr. Ferguson, actually, is, hearing our guest patients' comments, what would you say about how those kinds of societal views can actually impact patients who are really struggling to be diagnosed, first of all, they don't know what's going on, and then also maybe those who are diagnosed, but really kind of unsure of where to go from there?
Well, I think the idea that there is such a stigma really is what we're talking about around this, and that hair is part of identity. So I think when you are struggling in that way, you're not sure what your identity is, to get diagnosed, it can be even more difficult. Where do I go? What does this mean? There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of worry and anxiety. As guests have already all identified, this whole layer of many, many things. So clearly the surround for this does not help those who are newly diagnosed or struggling to get diagnosed.
Thanks for that, Dr. Ferguson.
I think every person with alopecia areata hits a pivotal moment when it goes from being just a little hair loss to, wow, this is a significant amount of hair loss and I might lose all of my hair. What was that defining moment like for you? And how did your medical support team factor into that? How did they help you? Did you start building a team of providers to support your journey? And was a mental health professional an option available to you along the way? I'll start with you, Christal. And I know that was a loaded question, so let me know if you need me to repeat.
I think my defining moment, and forgive me because I feel like I trauma blocked quite a bit of my experience just because it was so hard to go through. But I do remember my late teens, early 20s, I noticed the top of my head, it was shiny. And I couldn't understand why. And then I noticed that it started to get very itchy. And then the burning started and then bleeding started. It was a very bizarre set of circumstances. And I remember I went to my hairdresser and she actually pointed out, there's something going on with the top of your head. Like your hair's thinning. And being in my 20s, I kind of fluffed her off and she gave me some shampoos and she suggested that I go see my family doctor, which I didn't do. And it just progressively got worse and worse and worse to the point where it started to expand. So now I'm trying to be the MacGyver of hair and I'm doing all kinds of crazy things to try and cover up these patches, but still trying to figure out why my scalp is bleeding and why the pain is so severe. So that lasted for quite some time. In terms of medical providers, I did see a GP. Actually, no, I'm sorry. It was a dermatologist. And it took months to get that appointment. And when I did get that appointment, it was very dismissive. I had a bunch of questions. None were answered. The dermatologist basically looked at my scalp and said, oh, you're like the fourth or fifth person I've seen today with this. And I'm like, well, what is this? And it was just, well, it's alopecia. And I'm like, well, what is that? Did I eat something? Was it some sort of medication that I took? Did I rub something like a tree bark? What happened? What is going on? So it was a very quick appointment with little to no answers. I was prescribed a shampoo, a kind of a serum that kind of resembled olive oil, just a little bit thicker. And I think that was to help with the dryness because that was another symptom that I had. My scalp was very, very dry. And I just left there with more questions than answers. And the symptoms just got worse. And so did my anxiety and my depression and questioning my existence. Why is this happening to me when all of my family and friends, my cousins have that gorgeous Rudy Huxtable type hair and I'm dealing with this? It was very, very difficult in terms of seeing a mental health professional, not at the time. I didn't see anybody. I think I was just too lost in my feelings and thoughts and I was trying to figure it out on my own. I was doing a lot of Google searches and things like that to no avail. I was doing a lot of DIY treatments, trying to stimulate the hair growth and also alleviate the symptoms. But it was just a lot of searching on my own, trying to figure out what the problem was. So yeah, I didn't really seek a mental health professional during that time.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I don't know too much about scarring alopecia, but I can't even imagine having to go through the hair loss alone, plus the pain and the itching and the bleeding. That's just so much to have to go through. So you are incredible.
Thank you. And I did have the support of my mom. She's my rock and my ride or die. But it's hard as a parent to watch your child go through something like this when you can't help. And no matter what she did, it wasn't enough because it was beyond my scalp. This was now affecting me mentally. And even though I presented well, meaning I got dressed every day, I did my makeup, I put wigs on or put a scarf on, I was so broken on the inside.
I get it. How about you, Lauryn?
Yeah, my defining moment came early in the winter of 2014, and I had already had alopecia areata, but after losing all the hair on my head, I very rapidly started to lose my facial hair as well. And this experience was just distressing for me because, the timing felt really cruel. It was actually the morning of my first high school exam that I woke up without any brows or any eyelashes, and I looked at my reflection and I just felt so stark, and I couldn't really recognize myself. It was such a different appearance. And even though my peers would have been more focused on the math exam at hand that morning, I couldn't really wrap my head around this new identity that I was looking at. To the point of seeking medical support in the journey, I had already been seen by a dermatologist a few years earlier, fortunately, and I was on a course of a few different steroid injections and treatments along that line and that nature. So I started to seek treatment on that path. But in terms of mental health support, I really wish, knowing what I know now, that I sought out some regular counseling just to help me support myself in terms of coping with this new identity or this sort of new appearance that I was working with. I think even though I had some resources in terms of supportive friends and family that told me that I was still beautiful and I could still live a full and fulfilling life, I didn't necessarily have the kind of treatment that supports accepting where you are at in your journey and coping with a change like this.
And how about you, Sara?
Yeah, so even when I had patchy alopecia areata, so bald patches on my head, my hair was always really thin and light. So when I began to lose it all, it was really obvious. Clumps of hair would come out when my mom would brush it in the shower, and the bald patches just kept getting wider and wider. And it only took about 2 to 3 weeks before every single hair on my body was gone. And that's called alopecia universalis for anyone who isn't aware. I don't remember having any idea that losing all of my hair was possible. So once it started, there was really nothing my doctor or dermatologist could do. We just had to let it happen. And that was super scary because we didn't know what was happening at the time, and going through all those fears and anxieties about why it was happening and how to make it stop. Those were very overpowering. And even the treatment that I had been on for years, that worked for years, stopped working because I was so young. And because I was so young too, treatments were limited and there weren't really any other options besides getting a wig. But luckily, around the same time that I got my first wig, my mom and dad found Canaf. It was their way of making sure that I wasn't alone in this. It was both for me and for them. They could get advice and support from other parents, and I could make friends with other kids who lost their hair like I did. So although I didn't have a mental health professional at that time, I feel like I got a lot of my mental and emotional and social support from Canaf and the people that I met there. So that was really, really important to me. And yeah, so if you count everyone that I met at Canaf, I feel like I had a very big team at my side. So that was really helpful for me.
That's incredible. I'm glad they were there for you.
Yes, thank you all so much. And I completely agree with Supriya. It really does sound like all of you are stressing how important that support from others can be, especially during a pivotal, defining moment in your hair loss journeys.
And Adam, if I could jump in here, one of the things I'm hearing so clearly from all of the participants just underscores the point of this podcast, that it's more than hair loss. First of all, there's serious illness here that gets overlooked when it gets minimized to, oh, it's just hair. And it's a minimizing of what it means to a person about what their appearance is, especially in such a visual culture. So I think we've really heard firsthand how dramatically it is so much more than hair loss.
I couldn't agree more, Dr. Ferguson. I think everyone has made such great points. And I think one of the things, too, that came up for me is that there may be a lot of people who are in your corner and supporting you fully, but there might be some people who might say offhanded comments, might mean well, but say the wrong things. And I was wondering if you could answer something about that, which would be, how do you actually set healthy boundaries with people, when you might be losing your hair, and to tell people how you want to be treated, Everyone really has an opinion on a lot of things. And especially when somebody's hair starts falling out, how might setting healthy boundaries, how might that improve things?
Well, I think our guests here are going to have some great answers to that very important question. And I would imagine that for those who are listening in, some of whom are just starting to experience this and just starting to experience those unwanted comments, what I often say to my clients who are struggling with these things is we can have a couple responses. And I encourage them to practice these before they get surprised in the moment. One of them is, to just look at somebody and say, did you mean to be so personal? Or did you mean to be intrusive? We don't really know each other. I mean, just to really kind of give it back in that way. If it's a person that's closer to you, that is offering, a family member or a friend that's constantly offering advice, one of the things I'd say is you can say very kindly, that's just not helpful to me. That's not really helpful when you say that. And to be honest, and that's where the clear transparency is, where you have to help someone or train people, as you said, Adam, how to treat you. And finally, if those don't feel possible for you, one of the best is sort of the basic just silence. When someone says something, you just look at them and you just don't respond. The point here is to get your power back, to not feel like you've been intruded upon by somebody's even well-meaning comment, but nonetheless, it's intrusive and rude. And so how do you get your power back? But for most of us, we are not trained to respond in the moment particularly. And so I really encourage people, once you get past the sort of beginning where you're sort of in shock and surprised yourself at what's happening, let alone responding to others, when you realize you're going to keep running into this or people are going to keep commenting, to practice with a trusted person what some of those comments are. As you said, Supriya, wow, at least you have a beautifully shaped head. That would be, for me, one where we'd go silent and just look at them. But each of you will practice in your own way.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ferguson. I think that says volumes, actually, silence, that is.
So, Lauryn and Christal and Sara and Supriya, what has been your experience with setting those healthy boundaries with people who have opinions, welcome or not, about your hair loss? But what have you said or what have you found helpful in those situations?
Personally, I find that majority of the time, even if I really don't want to talk about it, it's a hard pill to swallow that we do want to acknowledge alopecia in order to spread awareness and in order to feel empowered and confident in our skin. So what I've found helpful is trying to set the tone by speaking about it with clarity and really trying to summon some confidence and courage, even though it feels really tough, and just trusting that if I'm emitting an energy that's positive and accepting, hopefully others will sort of match that energy in the best way that they can.
Thank you, Lauryn. That's just such a gracious and lovely response. Christal, what about you?
I think for me, I've had alopecia for over 20 years now. I think I've come into myself to the point where I just take a direct approach. When it comes to setting boundaries, I'm just very direct. And sometimes I try to extend grace, but it really depends on my bandwidth, because at the end of the day, someone's choosing to make a comment to me and be somewhat intrusive in my space. So I have to kind of set the tone on how I'm going to respond. And that really just depends on the situation. It's a day-to-day thing. So for me, for the most part, it just depends on the situation. It depends on how the person is asking the questions. Like Lauryn, you want to take an opportunity to educate and spread awareness. But at the same time, I do have a bit of what we call in the community explanation fatigue, because it does get exhausting, because I don't always want to talk about my hair loss because I'm so much more than my hair. Do you know what I mean? So sometimes I'm just not in the mood. And there are times when I'm more than happy to answer questions, but I just feel like it's one of those things where I just have to take it depending on how the situation is and not getting offended easily, because I used to get really offended before. And now I just learn to just take it with grace. And sometimes you do have to bite your tongue. Sometimes I do have elevator pitches in my mind, depending on where I'm going. Okay, if somebody says this to me, this is what I'm going to say. But then, of course, when the situation happens, all the elevator pitches are out the door and you don't remember anything that you thought of. But I think for the most part, people are curious. Some people just have no filter or social cues. And I think it's just depending on how I choose to, like Lauryn said, exude that energy, that will kind of convey the direction of the conversation. So for me, it's a direct approach. And I just say what I think and think what I say. So
And Christal, you really bring up such a great point that it's going to sometimes depend on the day how you respond, not just the person, but your own bandwidth. And you bring so much confidence to that.
thank you.
Sarah, what about you?
For me, as I am now, I'm comfortable with the way I look, so it's really just a matter of letting people know that. When someone tries to tell me how I can cure my hair loss overnight or to try rubbing coconut oil all over my head, I politely say, I appreciate your concern, but I'm happy with the way I look. Or I might say something like, Dr. Ferguson, I appreciate your concern, but saying that is not helpful to me. Here's what you can say to be supportive. I was able to better set boundaries when I took the time to understand why people have opinions about my alopecia. When a person sees someone with no hair, their brain instinctively registers that something is wrong. It's unnatural and it needs fixing. So they will offer their opinions and remedies because they assume that you also see your hair loss as something that needs fixing. But I don't believe I need fixing. So it's important to me that I tell others that so that next time when they see someone with alopecia, they may stop and think if what they're about to say will be kind and mindful or perpetuate a broken narrative about people with alopecia. So I really think what's most important is you just be honest with yourself and honest with the other person, and that will allow you to set healthy boundaries. And really, setting healthy boundaries is a form of self-love. So do it for that reason too.
Thank you, Sarah. Absolutely.
I think for me, I've never been very good at setting boundaries. When somebody makes a comment like that, it usually catches me so off guard that I become very awkward and internalize it and process it after the fact. So I'm probably not the best person to give advice here. But when I think about it from a perspective of somebody who's supporting a friend or a family member who is struggling with alopecia areata, to echo Sarah's point, we don't necessarily need you to fix our hair loss or solve a problem. I think a statement as simple as, I'm here for you, let me know how I can support you, and then let the person with alopecia drive the conversation would be so helpful. I wish that's the kind of feedback I had received when I was struggling. Well, thank you, everybody. That was all great insight. I think when a person is going through alopecia areata, there's often this fear that you're going to miss out on pieces of your life that you would have had with hair. I know for me, for a long time, I was convinced that because I was bald, I was never going to find love or go out in public without a wig or go on a roller coaster, go swimming at the beach. I had this internal list that I just kept adding to. And knowing you have little to no control over your hair loss, how do you reframe that mindset and realize you can still have a beautiful life and have all the experiences that our friends with hair have, regardless of if you have hair or not? I'll start with you, Sara.
Supriya, I love this question because this is literally what alopecia is about. It's about moving through the loss to find joy. One thing that I do is I practice gratitude every morning when I wake up. I count all the things in my life that I'm grateful for, even the tiniest things, because the tiniest things can be huge if you let them into your heart. For example, one thing I remind myself to be grateful for every day is the little plant in my kitchen window. To some people, it might just be a plant. Plants are everywhere. What's the big deal, right? But to me, it represents nature, light, growth, nurturing, like all the beautiful things about life that just happen. And also, it reminds me of friendship too, because it's a plant I received from a close friend of mine. It's really cliche, but you sometimes don't realize what you have until you lose something precious to you. And losing my hair gave me that ability to appreciate the world for all it gives. So yes, alopecia has given me a lot of fear, but it's also why I have a grateful mindset and why I find so much beauty in life too. So I definitely recommend practicing gratitude every day if you don't. You really start to feel a change in yourself in the way that you see the world when you do. You really have to frame it in terms of, I may not have hair, but look at all these other beautiful things that I do have. And when you're afraid of doing something because of your alopecia, just remember that you have options to make it possible. Like when I was younger, I used to be afraid of going swimming or going to the beach because I couldn't wear my wig. If I wore it in the water, it would get ruined. So my parents helped me find a swim bandana, and it had a little hair attachment too, so it looked like I still had hair under the bandana. And I wore that, and it really helped. And, you know, the situation wasn't perfect. I still had to hold on to it when I jumped into the pool, but it still allowed me to be more comfortable when swimming, and I reminded myself to be grateful for that. So yeah, practicing gratitude really changed my life.
That was so beautiful and so empowering. Thank you for sharing that with us, Sara. I love that so much. How about you, Lauryn?
I have to echo what Sara just said. It's such an excellent question, something that I find myself contemplating because I think there are a lot of ways to sort of redefine the narrative. But one thing that I've found helpful in my journey is constantly challenging my mindset and treating it almost like a garden. So I'm going to use Sara's plant analogy a little bit, but it's really about cultivating sort of this healthy mindset and sprinkling in joy and humor and love where you can, because what we can control are those parts of our day, right? How we speak to ourselves and how we sort of set up our environment. And my hope with that, if I'm treating my mind like I'm tending to a garden and sort of growing what it is that supports me, regardless of having hair or not, it can help me embrace life with alopecia and just remember that everyone is going through something unique. The experience that someone else is facing behind closed doors, we don't always know really what it's like, but I think with empathy and with finding the joy in how you relate to yourself and your experience, you can find some light in what sometimes feels like a dark turn of events. So whether it's losing your hair or losing someone you love, there's a lot to learn about being with yourself in the present moment and relating to your experience in a different, more positive way.
Thank you, Lauryn. I love that. I always like to say that you cannot have light without darkness. And so I feel like that's so true with alopecia as well. And how about you, Christal?
So this again is a great question. So for me, there's a couple things that I did to reframe my mindset. And one of them was how I spoke to myself, because I always say this, like, you have to be so careful how you talk to yourself and about yourself because you're always listening. And when I really realized that I was with myself 24/7, it was in that aha moment where I found the courage to actually look in the mirror again. And as much as I was uncomfortable with what I saw, I had to find the strength in the words to just kind of like be my own advocate and my own cheerleader. So I may not have felt beautiful, but I told myself I was beautiful anyways. And I kept saying it and kept saying it and kept saying it. Even as I was bawling my eyes out and my scalp was burning, words are powerful. And I think you really have to be careful how and what you say and what you surround yourself with, because those things can be very infectious to your state of mind. And another thing that I did to help my mindset was I did things afraid. I was petrified to do things, but I did them anyways, just because for me, I felt like if I'm not challenging myself and putting myself out there, how am I going to grow? And why am I going to allow something that I can't control, like my alopecia, define my narrative and be the author of my story? Like, that's not happening. So I literally had to flip the script on that. And it's a tough one because I'm trying not to cry because it's a bit of a trigger, but everything is in baby steps. And one thing that I did that I shared on our podcast was I learned to swim, and I'm 45 years old. So for anybody who's listening, I was petrified of water. And I was petrified of it because I didn't think that I could overcome the water. It was taking control, and it was like my alopecia. And I thought, you know what? If I can look in the mirror at my alopecia, then I can put my feet in this water. And I signed up for swimming lessons, and now I can swim. And I'm going to tell you something. When I put that swim cap on my bald head, it was probably one of the most liberating experiences ever, because in that moment, I felt so free. And I felt like, oh my gosh, alopecia doesn't have me. I have it. Like, it's how you change the narrative. And now I go to Aquafit. I'm not afraid of the water anymore. So why should I be afraid of my alopecia? So it's doing things afraid that I really think is really important to helping you just kind of walk through this audacity of hair loss,
Wow. When you said, now I can swim, I feel like physically you could swim, but also it was almost metaphorically you were just swimming and alive again. And I love that so much. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Dr. Ferguson, how do you redefine your identity when a physical piece of yourself has experienced such a drastic change? I guess in other words, what we're wondering is if patients are struggling to find beauty or find the silver lining in the loss, How would you suggest they tackle this?
Thanks, Lauren. I am so inspired listening to the four of you that it's very clear to me that the place you begin is by finding others in the community who have walked the journey ahead of you so that there are some role models and there's some wisdom that can be shared. I think it's very hard all by yourself to try to make sense of it, although clearly all four of you have in your own ways redefined the narrative, as Christal said, or found a way to find gratitude or to open yourself to the new part of your life. And at the same time, you've had support. So I think support is a piece of it, role models who have walked it ahead of you, and understanding. And it feels like all of you have found ways to give yourselves grace that it's not going to be a perfect linear journey. There's going to be ups and there's going to be downs. And how do you give yourself a little bit of a pat on the back on the hard days and a shout out and cheer on the good days? Part of that is having a community around you as well. So support, role models, understanding everything takes time. All of you have shared the way in which it has evolved for you, and along the way, you've changed, you've allowed yourself to change, you've gathered in new resources, you found a way to share resources. So I'm inspired by you, and I think you all have basically written the book on this.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ferguson. And actually, what you said and what our guests have said, I just wanted to jump in quickly to ask a follow-up question to all of this because it was such an incredible conversation. And before we start to wrap up, I wanted to know actually how you, Christal, Lauryn, Sara, how you all met, because we've heard a lot on today's recording about the importance of community and about mutual support amongst patients and then friends and family as community. And I know that you all have an incredible podcast that you've done, which is Alopecia's Audacity, which is going really strong. And I know, for example, before we began, Supriya was actually recognized from her social media. So I think it all just speaks to the importance of community when dealing and living with alopecia or alopecia areata specifically.
Sara, do you want to take the lead on how we met?
Sure. Well, it was actually Lauryn and I who met first. We both met when we were much younger because we both joined CANAF at a pretty young age, and we met through CANAF. We first became friends as we both were searching for support from the community, and then we both kind of grew into volunteers, and both our moms joined the board of directors and are still on the board of directors today. And so we've kind of been through this whole journey together and kind of grown a family from it. It's kind of beautiful to think about. And then Christal, we actually met her through CANAF as well when she joined the board in 2020, I believe, right, Christal?
I think so. Yeah. I was actually looking for someone to talk to because I'd been isolating myself for over 20 years. And I was like, okay, I can't do this alone. And of course, me being queen of Google, I did a search and CANAF popped up and they were having a support session. And I guess the rest is history because I attended the support session and I was like, I need to be a part of this organization. I don't know what I'm going to do, but I need to be a part of it. And I actually applied to be a volunteer. And then I ended up being a board member. And that's how I met Sara and Lauryn. And I feel like it's been so magical. And I don't know, I feel like they're like my sisters. And if I didn't come out of my shell, I don't think I would have met the two of them or CANAF as a whole. And it's just opened up my eyes to this incredible community of people. So that's kind of how I met Sara and Lauryn.
Yeah, it's definitely a blessing to think about. If none of us had alopecia, we never would have met. This never would have happened. So when we talk about silver linings, this is a huge one.
But it took coming out of your shells or out of your isolation that all of you, and Supriya, I just love that you have this Instagram account that we can follow, that being out in the world is part of what made that connection possible.
It's true. There's so much beauty in vulnerability. It allows us to connect in a way that is hard to put into words, I think.
I think when I was first losing my hair, I was so scared to connect with the community because to me, it made it all feel too real. And early on, I just wanted my hair back so badly that I was just scared that anything I did or thought or ate or said would cause more hair to fall out. But once I accepted myself for who I was and connected with the community, I realized the alopecia areata community has some of the most beautiful, strong, inspiring human beings on the planet. And it's always such an honor to meet with them, talk with them, become friends with them. So this entire podcast is just completely filling my cup today.
And Supriya, we are so glad that you ended up joining the community because you are just an incredible role model and such an inspiring force. Just talking to you today has just, I don't know, it's just lightened something inside of me just seeing you. So thank you so much for what you do.
Thank you. That's how I feel about the three of you right now.
That's exactly how I feel as well, actually. And I don't live with alopecia areata. I've just learned so much, and everything that all of you have said, I think it just beautifully sums up the inherent importance of understanding that alopecia areata and other forms of alopecia are just about so much more than lost hair. It's about community. It's moving through the loss to find joy. It's beauty in the vulnerability and connection in vulnerability, I think, very importantly. And I think all of those things are just those true silver linings that losing hair and going through that process and living with the condition, it's almost a vehicle to create and forge like a found family. And I think a lot of people can identify with that. So I just thank you all so much for sharing, because I think it's really going to resonate with a lot of people, including those who, of course, live with alopecia, any forms of it, but also people who don't live with alopecia. And I think that's really the important lessons of this episode today. And to close, I wanted to ask Dr. Ferguson something we've asked on previous episodes, which is, what is one word or phrase or a piece of advice that you would want our listeners and fellow alopecia areata patients in Canada and around the world to remember from today's episode?
Well, I just want to amplify something Christal said, because it is universally true and clearly very true in this community. And that is, how do you take control of the narrative? How do you tell your story in a way where you get to be who you want to be and live the way you do? And I'm just grateful for the inspiration that came from each story today. And I'm going to take that with me because it does create hope. As you all said at the beginning of the episode, we hope this would create hope.
So much hope. Sara, Lauryn, and Christal, same question for all of you. What would be your one word or phrase or piece of advice our listeners and alopecia areata patients should keep in mind? Starting with Sara.
Ooh, good question. I would say reach out. You're never alone in this. Myself, Christal, Lauryn, Supriya, Kanaf, our friends at GHLF, we're all here to help. Nobody should struggle alone with hair loss, and there's a wide community and lots of resources out there that can make it easier. I wouldn't be here today on this podcast if it weren't for my parents reaching out to Kanaf when they did. I wouldn't have so many of the strategies and tools that I have if I didn't later on reach out to a mental health professional to work through my alopecia in a new way. So that's really the best piece of advice that I can give. Just reach out.
I love that. Christal, how about you?
I always get stumped with this question because there's so much I want to say. I think one piece of advice I would say to your listeners is that I see you because I am you. And I don't want you to isolate yourself the length of time that I did. Because, like I said before, it's taken me 20 years to come out of my shell. And I've felt every single emotion that you're feeling to anybody who's listening, and I get it. And the thing about hair loss is it's disrespectful, it's unpredictable, but it's so beautiful if you're just willing to put one foot in front of the other. And this community is incredible, and we're just here to listen. We offer support, and don't be afraid to email somebody with alopecia. You may be surprised that you'll get a response because we all get it. And we've been through it, and we're all just trying to navigate it day by day the best we can. So don't isolate yourself and just reach out. That's all I can say is just reach out. We're here. We're here. And we love you, and we think you're beautiful with or without hair. That would be my advice.
Wow. The statement, I see you because I am you, is so powerful. Thank you for sharing that with us. And Lauryn?
These sentiments have been so heartwarming, and I echo what Christal was saying. It's such a difficult question just to wrap your head around, but I guess my thoughts are that it's about the walk with alopecia, right? None is completely alike. Everyone has their own unique experience with it, but something that we can take comfort in is knowing that the roadmap that everyone's following is just putting one foot in front of the other. So even if that sounds a little bit trite, we're all on this similar walk, and though day to day our encounters will differ and external factors will contribute in different ways. It's really just about doing what you can and taking it one day at a time.
Amazing. I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much.
And a huge thanks to all of our guests today, Dr. Ferguson, Christal, Lauryn, Sara. I can't wait for this episode to premiere. There's going to be so many great gems in here, and just to thank you all for your vulnerability and being so willing to open up and to speak with us about this. I really think it's going to make a huge impact on the community, and it again just speaks to what this is really all about, which I think is about community and about finding strength and vulnerability. So thanks again. And that brings us to the end of this episode of From Hair to There, a podcast about alopecia. This podcast was made possible with support from Pfizer Canada. We hope the stories, insights, and voices we've shared have touched you, educated you, and made your journey a little brighter.
Living with alopecia areata is more than just hair. It's about resilience, identity, and community. And together, we're building that community one story at a time. If our words resonated with you, please take a moment to rate us, leave us a glowing review, and share this podcast with your friends, family, and networks. Every share amplifies our voice and helps someone out there feel understood. And if you have any questions, comments, or episode topic ideas, you can email us at podcast@ghlf.org.
And remember, whether you're on the path of acceptance, seeking treatments, or anywhere in between, we're with you, from hair to there.
Be inspired, supported, and empowered. This is the Global Healthy Living Foundation Podcast Network.